There is a man who once believed he had wasted his whole life. He had made game after game that almost no one played, and when he finally poured himself into a gentle little family project about a father and son running a lumber business, the kindest thing the world could find to say was that his cheerful cartoon animals looked like broken staring machines, like something that would come alive in the dark and hurt you. It broke his heart. He thought about giving up entirely, about walking away from the only thing he had ever wanted to do. And then quietly, he made a strange decision. He decided that if the world thought his creations were terrifying, he would give the world something truly terrifying on purpose. Out of that wound came one of the most beloved and mysterious horror stories of our time. Tonight, softly and slowly, we are going to wander all the way through it, one small fact at a time. So let yourself settle in. There is nothing to fear here, and nothing to solve, no cameras to watch, and no doors to hold shut. If drifting through the strange, sad, secret history of Five Nights at Freddy's is the kind of thing that helps you let the day go, you're welcome to leave a gentle like on the video, and if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight, so this quiet little room has a few more friendly faces in it. And now, with no hurry at all, let's go back to the very beginning. Before the pizzeria, before the animatronics, back to a discouraged man at a computer, about to change his life without knowing it. The man was named Scott Cawthon, and he had been making games for a very long time before almost anyone knew his name. He had spent years building modest projects, many of them Christian and family friendly, most of them quietly ignored. The game that changed everything for him was not even a horror game at all. It was a peaceful business simulation about lumber, full of friendly woodland characters, and the feedback that stung the most was that one of those characters moved in a stiff, jerky way that reminded people of a haunted machine. It was meant as criticism. He chose to take it as an idea, that small, cruel piece of feedback lodged in his mind, and instead of ignoring it, he leaned into it completely. If people saw menace in stiff animatronic creatures, he thought, then a story built entirely around stiff animatronic creatures, watching, waiting, moving only when you looked away, might be genuinely frightening. It was a remarkable act of turning failure into fuel, taking the exact thing people had mocked and making it the beating heart of something new. The whole enormous franchise that followed rests on that single decision to listen to an insult and answer it with a nightmare. He built the first game largely alone, a one-man operation, using a piece of accessible game-making software rather than the vast professional tools of big studios, and creating the three-dimensional look of the characters with a modelling program. That humble toolkit is part of why the whole thing feels so uncanny. The animatronics are rendered images rather than living models holding unnaturally still, and that stillness, born partly of technical limitation, became the game's greatest source of dread. Sometimes the scariest thing is a thing that simply will not move, until, suddenly, it has. He put the game up for the world to vote on through a platform where players could help decide which independent games deserved a wider release, and he shared a trailer, and then a small playable taste of it. It arrived quietly in the late summer of a year that would soon belong to it entirely. There was no marketing budget, no publisher, no fanfare, just a strange little game about surviving 5 night shifts at a haunted pizza restaurant, sitting there waiting for someone to notice it. And notice it they did, in a way almost no one could have predicted. The game found its way into the hands of popular online performers who filmed themselves playing it, and audiences watched them flinch and scream and laugh in terror and something caught fire. The particular design of the game, all tension and sudden shocks and helpless watching, was perfectly suited to being watched as much as played. It spread from screen to screen like a rumour, and within weeks a discouraged developer who had nearly quit found himself at the centre of a phenomenon. What happened next was almost dizzying in its speed. Rather than resting on a single success, the man behind it poured out sequel after sequel at a pace that stunned the industry, so that in less than a single year several full games in the series had appeared. The franchise even earned a place in the record books for releasing the most sequels to a video game in a single year, a testament not only to his relentless work, but to the hunger of an audience that could not get enough of the mystery he was building. The floodgates had opened, and they would not close for a very long time. The first game itself is a masterpiece of doing a great deal with very little. You sit in a small office, unable to leave your chair, watching a bank of security cameras, listening to the building around you. You cannot run, and you cannot fight. Your only defences are 2 heavy doors and 2 lights, and a limited supply of power that drains a little faster every time you use anything. As the night wears on and the power runs lower, you must choose again and again between seeing what is coming and being able to shut it out. A slow strangling of your own options until the dark closes in. The threats in that office are 4 animatronic performers from the restaurant's happier days: a bear, a rabbit, a chicken and a fox, each with its own pattern of movement through the dark building toward you. They do not lumber after you like ordinary monsters. They shift from room to room only when you are not looking at them, freezing whenever a camera falls upon them, so that the whole game becomes a desperate act of attention, of keeping track of where each of them was the last time you dared to look. The horror is not in the chase. It is in the waiting, and in the terrible mathematics of a power meter ticking towards 0. Each night runs from midnight until 6 in the morning, and that little clock is your only real goal, a number in the corner ticking with agonizing slowness toward dawn. There is no winning, only surviving, only lasting until the clock rolls over to 6, and a chorus of cheering children signals that you have made it through one more night. The whole design is a held breath stretched across 6 hours compressed into a few real minutes, and the relief of hearing that morning bell is one the game rations out sparingly, so that dawn itself becomes the sweetest reward it can offer. The fox in the corner behaves unlike the others, and generations of players have learned to dread him in a special way. He hides behind a curtain in his own little cove, and rather than creeping room to room, he waits, peeking out further and further the less you check on him, until at last he comes sprinting down the hall in a sudden desperate dash, and your only hope is to slam the door before he reaches you. He punishes both neglect and over-attention at once. A threat that runs on a different rhythm than everything else, always just about to break into motion. A voice keeps you company through those first nights, a recorded message left by the man who held the job before you, cheerfully and nervously explaining the rules of survival even as it becomes clear that things did not end well for him. This phone caller became one of the most beloved figures in the whole series despite never being seen. His calm, rambling, increasingly worried instructions a lifeline and a warning at once. For the first several games, that voice, and nearly every other voice, was performed by the creator himself, quietly lending his own tones to the story he was telling. That recorded voice grows quietly more disturbing as the week goes on. His calls begin friendly and helpful, but by the later nights his tone frays, and in the message that plays on the 5th night, His voice is cut off by the sounds of the animatronics reaching him at last, dissolving into distorted noise and a final, garbled groan. It is never spoken plainly, but the implication is clear and awful, that the cheerful man who spent the week teaching you how to survive did not survive himself, and that you have been listening all along to the last words of a dead man. The most dreaded moment of that first game is the one where the lights go out. If your power drains completely before dawn, the office falls dark and silent, and then, in that darkness, the golden face of the bear appears in the doorway, lit only by its flashing eyes, while a slow tinkling music box melody plays, an old marching tune rendered sweet and unbearable. You sit there in the dark, listening to that little song, knowing what is coming and unable to stop it, waiting through those final seconds for the end. It is one of the cruelest and most brilliant sequences in the game, turning helplessness itself into the final scare. The game is stitched through with small hidden things for the watchful, secrets that reward the kind of player who lingers. There is a poster in the office you can click to make a cartoon nose honk, a moment of absurd levity in a place of dread. There are rare, fleeting flashes, appearing seemingly at random, of unsettling images and the words "it's me," gone almost before you can be sure you saw them. And there is a golden, empty version of the bear that can materialize in your office through a chance so slim you might play for years and never trigger it. A ghost within the ghost story. Some of those hidden details do more than frighten. Certain posters and signs in the restaurant will occasionally flicker, just for a moment, into newspaper clippings, telling of children who went missing and of a beloved family restaurant slowly dying under the weight of tragedy and scandal. These tiny, easily missed changes were the first threads of a much larger story, planted so quietly that at first almost no one realized there was a story at all. The game seemed to be about surviving the night. It was really about uncovering a decades-old horror, one flickering clipping at a time. There is a gentle piece of trivia about the characters' very names that fans have always loved. The bear, the rabbit, the chicken and the fox were only ever meant to be nicknames, placeholders the creator used while he worked, with the intention of giving them proper formal names later on. But over the long months of building the game, he grew so fond of the casual little names that he simply kept them, so that Freddy and Bonnie and Chica and Foxy earned their identities not through grand design, but through the quiet affection of the man who made them. There is another small marvel hidden in the very shape of the building. When players took the map of the restaurant and turned it upside down, some noticed that its outline formed a familiar blocky figure, and that figure turned out to be the creator's own personal logo, his avatar, the little symbol he used to represent himself. It was as though he had signed his name into the bones of the place, a private mark folded into the architecture of the nightmare, waiting to be found by anyone curious enough to look at the whole thing from a different angle. Beneath all the jump scares and the ticking power meter, a story was quietly taking shape, and it is a story so layered and so deliberately hidden that people have spent more than a decade piecing it together. It is worth saying gently, before we go further, that much of this tale is told in fragments, in flickers and mini-games and scattered hints, and that a great deal of it remains a matter of interpretation rather than plain statement. The game rarely tells you anything directly. It shows you pieces, and trusts you, and lets you wonder. So much of what follows is the story as the community has slowly, carefully assembled it, and where the truth is uncertain, it is uncertain on purpose. At the dark centre of it all is a man the earliest games showed only as a shadowy figure in purple, a man who would eventually be given the name William Afton. The story that emerged over many games paints him as a brilliant, cold engineer, one of the two founders of the pizza restaurants at the heart of the series, a maker of wonderful machines who used his gifts for something monstrous. He is the shadow behind every game, the source of the hauntings, a murderer whose crimes set every restless spirit in the whole saga in motion. Almost everything terrible that happens can be traced, in the end, back to him. The founding wound of the entire series is an event the community came to call the Missing Children Incident. The story suggests that the man in purple lured a small group of children away from the safety of the crowded restaurant, gaining their trust before killing them and hiding their bodies inside the very animatronic performers the children had loved. It is a genuinely dark thing at the heart of what is, on its surface, a game about cartoon animals, and it is precisely that contrast, the cheerful and the horrific pressed together, that gives the whole series its particular, haunting flavour. But the children, the story tells us, did not simply vanish. Their spirits are said to have remained, bound to the machines that had become their tombs, which is why the animatronics move in the dark and why they seem to want something from you. In one gentle and sorrowful reading, they are not hunting the night guard out of evil, but out of confusion and grief, mistaking the living for the man who wronged them, or seeking a father figure, or simply lost and angry and unable to rest. The monsters, in other words, are the victims. That quiet tragedy runs underneath every scare in the series. Watching over those lost children is one of the most important and mysterious figures in the whole story. A tall, thin, weeping puppet, often simply called the marionette. The story implies that this figure holds a special sorrow and a special power, and that it was this being who gave the murdered children their restless second life within the machines, an act of grief and vengeance both. Later hints suggest that the puppet itself is inhabited by the spirit of a particular little girl, the daughter of the restaurant's other founder, the very first of the man in purple's victims, which knocks the whole tragedy even tighter together. That other founder became known to players as Henry, the man who built the animatronics alongside the killer and who carries his own terrible grief through the story. If the man in purple is the story's shadow, Henry is something closer to its aching conscience. A father who lost his own child to his partner's cruelty, and who spends the rest of the saga trying, in his quiet and sorrowful way, to set things right. The two founders, one a monster and one a mourner, stand at the opposite poles of the whole long tale, and everything else spins between them. The way the man in purple ultimately meets his fate is one of the most memorable and gruesome pieces of the lore, and it hinges on a very particular kind of machine. Some of the early animatronic suits were built to serve two purposes, able to function as costumes a person could wear as well as automated performers, held safe by delicate spring-loaded mechanisms. The story tells that years after his crimes, cornered by the vengeful spirits of the children he had killed, the man hid inside one of these old spring-loaded suits. The mechanisms failed, metal snapped inward, and he died slowly and horribly inside the very kind of machine he had used to murder. Yet even death did not release him, which is perhaps the darkest turn of all. His body decayed inside that ruined suit, but his spirit, too full of malice to move on, remained trapped within it, creating the shambling, rotted horror the players came to know as Springtrap. It is a grim poetry, the killer becoming forever one with the costume of the very animal he had once used to lure his victims, neither fully alive nor allowed to rest. a monster made of guilt and metal and old, dried blood, condemned to haunt the ruins of his own crimes. There are two terrible injuries woven into the series' history that fans have long puzzled over, both spoken of in hushed, uncertain tones. One is remembered as the bite of 87, an incident referenced in the very first games, in which one of the animatronics is said to have bitten a person so severely that they lost a portion of their brain and yet somehow survived. For a long time no one was quite sure who was bitten or by which machine, and the mystery of it became one of the community's earliest obsessions, a wound in the story's past hinted at but never fully shown. The other, and the more heartbreaking, is the injury at the centre of the fourth game, an event that came to be called the Bite of 83. This one is bound up with a small, frightened child and a golden bear, and the story it tells, gently and through nightmares rather than plain scenes, is of a little boy tormented by his older sibling and terrified of the restaurant's machines, who is lifted as a cruel prank toward the mouth of an animatronic and bitten fatally. It is one of the saddest threads in the entire saga, a child's death caused not by the murderer, but by ordinary childhood cruelty gone horribly wrong. That grieving family, the story strongly implies, is the murderer's own. The man in purple in this reading is a father, and the child killed by the golden bear is his youngest son, and the older sibling responsible for the fatal prank is another of his children. It reframes the entire series as in part a family tragedy, a household destroyed from within, the maker of monsters losing his own child to the machines he built, and perhaps beginning his descent into darkness in the wake of that loss. The horror, again and again, turns out to be a story about broken families and unbearable grief. With that hidden story in mind, it is worth walking slowly through the games one by one, for each reshaped the nightmare in its own way. The second game, though numbered second, actually reaches backward in time, a prequel set years before the first, in a brighter and busier version of the restaurant. Here the old animatronics are joined by a set of newer, sleeker models, toy versions with smoother faces and friendlier designs, built to win back a nervous public. Among them is a strange, broken creature meant to be taken apart and reassembled by children, a tangle of parts often called mangle, and it is this pitiful, mangled thing that many believe was responsible for the famous bite that haunts the series' history. That second game rethought nearly every rule of the first, and made itself stranger and more frantic in the process. The heavy doors were gone entirely, replaced by a single open office you could not seal, leaving you far more exposed. In their place you were given a flashlight with a draining battery and, most memorably, an empty animatronic head you could pull down over your own face, a hollow bear mask meant to fool the wandering machines into mistaking you for one of their own. Survival became a desperate juggling act of light and disguise, flicking between the vents and the hall and slapping on the mask whenever something drew too near. That second game also introduced a small mechanic that became legendary for its stress, a music box that had to be kept wound from across the building, or a certain vengeful spirit would come for you. Amid all your other desperate tasks, you had to keep returning your attention to that winding box, keeping its gentle tune playing, because the moment the music stopped, the weeping puppet would stir. It turned a lullaby into a source of pure dread, a sweet melody that meant safety only so long as you never ever let it fall silent. Among the new arrivals in that busy restaurant, one became infamous, a small, wide-eyed figure clutching a balloon and a sign, who does not kill you himself, but does something almost worse. He slips into your office to disable your lights and leave you blind and defenceless in the dark, giggling all the while. players learned to fear that laugh more than many of the outright killers, because it meant the safety of the light had been taken away and something else was surely coming down the vent toward you in the black. The game let players glimpse the story's buried heart directly, through small pixelated minigames tucked between the nights, playable scenes rendered in a deliberately crude, childlike style. In one, you play as an animatronic giving cake to children while, outside a window, a small purple figure lingers by a crying child, and the child, later, lies still. In others, you are urged by desperate on-screen words to save them, to give gifts and give life, guiding a weeping puppet to lay presents on the bodies of murdered children. These crude little scenes, wrapped in cheerful pixel colours, were where players first truly understood that this was a story about the killing of children and the restless spirits left behind. The third game leaps forward instead, 30 years after the original restaurant, to a horror attraction built by people trying to cash in on the local legend of the haunted pizzeria. This time there is only one truly dangerous animatronic to fear, the rotted spring locked horror containing the murderer's trapped soul, drawn back to the place where it all began. You juggle 3 fragile systems: the cameras, the ventilation that keeps you from hallucinating, and an audio device that lets you lure the monster away with the sound of a child's voice, any of which can fail and force a frantic reboot at the worst possible moment. The other figures haunting that attraction are only phantoms, ghostly flickers of the burnt and broken animatronics of the past. They cannot truly harm you, but they can lunge from the shadows to startle you into a panic, causing your systems to fail and leaving you vulnerable to the one thing that can. It was a clever inversion of everything that came before, a game where most of the monsters are illusions and the real danger is singular and patient, so that the true horror is never quite knowing which scares are hollow and which one is the thing that will actually end you. That third game held the series' most tender secret behind its hardest puzzles, a hidden good ending earned only through obscure mini-games scattered across the nights. Following faint clues, comforting the wandering pixel spirits, a devoted player could eventually reach a final scene in which all the murdered children gather together at a small party, wearing paper masks before quietly vanishing one by one, set free at last. Reaching it caused the ghostly children's faces to go dark on the attraction's title screen, a signal that they had finally moved on. It remains one of the most quietly beautiful things in the whole series, a reward measured not in survival, but in mercy, in letting the dead finally rest. The fourth game turned the fear as small and intimate as it could go, shrinking the whole world down to a single child's bedroom in the dark. There were no cameras here, and no power to ration, only a small boy with a flashlight and his own frightened ears. You crept between 2 doors, a closet, and the bed behind you, listening for the faint breathing of something waiting in the hall, and the game's cruelest trick was that shining your light at the wrong moment, when a monster was already there, invited it in rather than warding it off. It asked you to master silence and patience and the terrible discipline of listening, and it made the ordinary geography of a bedroom into a landscape of dread. The monsters of that bedroom were nightmarish, exaggerated versions of the familiar animatronics, all jagged teeth and glinting eyes and impossible size, the way childhood fears distort the things that frighten us into something far larger than life. There was a monstrous bear whose small companions gathered on the bed if you looked away too long, a fox that lurked in the closet, and, most fearsome of all, a golden nightmare that could undo you in an instant. The whole design seemed to understand that the fears of a small child are not reasonable or measured, but enormous and shapeless and hungry, and it built its horrors to match. Between the nights, that fourth game told its heartbreaking little story through minigames of a weeping boy wandering a world that terrified him, and it scattered small, devastating clues about what was really happening. On the bedside table, now and then, a player might glimpse a vase of flowers, or a bottle of pills, or the drip of a hospital line. Quiet hints that the child might be lying somewhere hurt, dreaming, dying. The game never explained these things outright, leaving them to be noticed and pieced together. And in doing so, it made the whole nightmare feel less like a game and more like the fevered final imaginings of a broken little boy. That fourth game hid an extra challenge that became a small legend of frustration, a mini-game in which a little spring-suited plush creature crept toward you down a darkened hall, and you had to freeze him in place with quick flashes of your light, stopping him on a mark on the floor. It demanded a careful, nerve-wracking attention to the sound of tiny footsteps, and succeeding granted you a small advantage in the nights ahead. It was a perfect miniature of the whole series' tension, distilled into a single hallway and a single scampering toy, all listening and timing and held breath. Tucked among these darker chapters was a sunny, unexpected role-playing detour, a game so unlike the rest that it startled everyone. It let cartoon versions of the animatronics adventure together through colourful worlds, trading horror for whimsy and jokes, and it had a rocky enough beginning that it was briefly pulled back and later offered again for free, an unusual stumble for so successful a series. Yet even this cheerful oddity buried fragments of the deeper lore in its secret corners, including a strange, quiet figure who fishes alone at a pond and murmurs about leaving a demon to its rest, a small melancholy presence who would return, years later, in another game entirely. The next major chapter took players somewhere new and strange, an underground facility full of sleeker, more elegant and more disturbing animatronics, in a game that finally let its characters speak at length. Rather than a crackling phone, you were guided by a cheerful automated voice that greeted you each night and insisted, with increasing absurdity, on assigning you comical randomized names. That bright, oblivious corporate cheerfulness, layered over the genuine danger of the place, gave the whole chapter a particular flavour of dread, the sense of being processed by a smiling system that did not care in the slightest whether you lived or died. The animatronics of that facility were elegant and terrible in equal measure. The dancing ballerina you had to navigate by sound in the pitch dark, a bright performer on her stage, and a clown-like bear with a small hand puppet of his own. Night by night you were sent crawling through the guts of the building on maintenance tasks that grew more clearly like a trap with every passing hour. The polished beauty of these machines made them somehow worse than the battered horrors of the earlier games, the sense that something so graceful and so carefully made could want, so patiently, to take you apart. The heart of that underground chapter was a tall clown-like girl, whose gentle, sorrowful voice told you in pieces the story of a child drawn to her death, and who slowly revealed herself as the trapped soul of the murderer's own daughter. In a horrible irony, the animatronic had been secretly built to identify a lone child and lure them close with an offering of ice cream before killing them. And the story implies it was the maker's own daughter who became its first victim, wandering too close, enchanted by a machine her father had designed to kill. Even the murderer, the story suggests, was not spared the loss of his children to his own creations. The game let that clown girl speak at length, confiding in you, warning you, guiding you. so that you came to feel something almost like tenderness for her even as the danger closed in. It was a bold thing, to build a horror game around a monster you came to pity and even care for, and it deepened the series' central aching idea that its creatures are victims first and terrors second. She was frightening, yes, but she was also a little girl who had died alone, and the game never let you forget it. That chapter's most infamous turn came when the joined-together machines hollowed out the very technician you had been playing as, wearing his body to escape into the world above. The story strongly implies this technician was another of the murderer's sons, and in a haunting final scene his stolen, decaying body speaks, refusing to die, driven by a whispered promise to find his father and put an end to him. That image of a pale, purple, rotting man who simply will not fall, murmuring that he is still here and that he is coming, is one of the most unforgettable and unsettling the series ever produced. The chapter that followed served as a kind of grand, fiery reckoning, disguised cleverly as a cheerful little business game. For much of it you simply run your own small pizza restaurant, buying attractions and decorations from a catalogue, testing them, tending to the books, often blissfully unaware of the danger gathering around you. Many of those catalogue attractions carried a quiet risk, a chance of lawsuits and disasters hidden in the fine print, so that even the sunny act of shopping for your restaurant hummed with a low comic dread. It was one of the series' great tricks, wrapping its darkest and most important chapter in the bright wrapping paper of a management game. Woven through that restaurant game were the salvage sequences, tense little gambles in which you were offered ruined animatronics found in the alley and asked whether to risk hauling them inside for extra money. Each one had to be studied and logged as it stirred in the dark, and each was, in truth, one of the great evils of the series drawn back into one place. The murderer's daughter, the hollowed tangle of machines, the rotted killer himself, all lured in one by one. The whole cheerful little enterprise was, you slowly realized, a trap, patiently baited by the restaurant's grieving other founder to gather every lingering horror under a single roof. That chapter hid 3 more of the series' most studied minigames, small pixel scenes that deepened the tragedy in strange and troubling ways. One followed a child and a dog through a haunting maze, tied to another of the murders. One, strangely still, put you behind the wheel of a car driving home through a rainy night to a troubled household, a scene fans have argued over endlessly, full of implications about another broken family that may sit at the story's edges. And one showed a security puppet failing, heartbreakingly, to reach and protect a little girl left alone in the rain. The first death that set the whole weeping puppet tragedy in motion. The ending of that chapter delivered the emotional summit of the entire saga, as the grieving founder set his trap alight and spoke. Through a recording, a long and gentle farewell to every soul gathered in the burning building. He addressed the murdered children and promised them release, addressed his own lost daughter with unbearable tenderness, and addressed the murderer with cold finality, offering him no escape from the flames. It was a benediction and a reckoning at once, a father laying every lost child to rest at the cost of his own life, and it moved countless players in a way few game endings ever have, turning a horror series, for one long quiet moment, into something like a eulogy. The game that followed was less a new story than a grand, difficult celebration, gathering an enormous roster of characters from across the whole series into a single brutal survival challenge. 50 animatronics could menace you at once, each with its own particular behaviour to learn and counter, in a test of skill so demanding it became legendary among players. The story framed this endless torment, in one gentle reading, as a personal hell for the murderer himself, condemned to be hunted forever by the ghosts of his own making, tormented in the dark by a voice that promised him this suffering would never ever end. That celebration hid, among its many secrets, the return of the lonely fisherman and his quiet offer of peace. And the contrast said everything about the series' strange soul. Here was a game overflowing with 50 screaming machines and a hell built for a murderer, and tucked inside it, reachable only by the patient, was a soft little scene of sitting by a pond and choosing to catch a single fish and let a tormented soul rest rather than dragging it back into endless suffering. The series always held those two things together, the shriek and the lullaby, the endless torment and the quiet mercy, and it trusted its players to feel the weight of both. As new technology arrived, the series stepped into virtual reality, and the old office terrors took on a horrible new closeness. Strapping on a headset placed you truly inside the pizzeria, able to turn your head and reach out your hands, the animatronics now looming at their real and dreadful scale, close enough to touch. The game framed itself cleverly as a collection of the earlier games rebuilt as attractions within the fiction, a company trying to repackage its grim history as harmless entertainment, and that framing became the doorway for a brand new thread of story to slip in. That virtual chapter introduced a fresh form for old evil, a glitching. Dancing figure in a spring suit costume lurking within the game's own code, a presence the hidden developers' warning tapes came to call an anomaly. Those tapes, left by an unseen woman who had discovered something wrong buried in the software, warned that a malicious thing was hiding in the data and must not be allowed to spread. The idea was quietly terrifying, that the murderer's malice had found a way to survive even the destruction of his body by becoming a kind of virus, no longer needing metal and rubber, only a screen and a willing mind to crawl into. Through that digital haunting, the story suggests the evil reached out to corrupt the very person testing the game, planting a seed that would grow into one of the series' later villains, and hid a fragile hope in a small arcade minigame threaded through the experience. In that pixel quest, a little princess ventured against the glitching rabbit, offering, for those who completed it, a chance to strike back against the spreading corruption. It was a lovely, hopeful counterweight to the dread, a tiny heroic story buried inside the larger horror, a reminder that the series always left, somewhere, a narrow path toward the light. The series even reached into the everyday world through a mobile game that used the technology of augmented reality, letting the animatronics appear to invade a player's own home. Through the phone in your pocket, the machines could seem to stalk toward you across your real living room, salvaged and repaired, and sent out for delivery like some monstrous subscription, collapsing the safe distance between the horror and your actual life. It was a clever extension of the series' central fear, the idea that these things could come for you not in some distant pizzeria but right here, in the familiar rooms where you were supposed to feel safe. The most ambitious game in the whole series arrived after the creator had stepped back, built by a new studio and set inside an enormous, glittering entertainment complex. A vast neon mall of shops and arcades and attractions that dwarfed the cramped offices of the older games. This time you played as a small boy locked inside after closing, and rather than being hunted from a fixed chair, you were free to roam the entire sprawling building, hiding and running and exploring through the long hours of the night. It traded the series' signature claustrophobia for a huge open space, a bold and divisive reinvention that made the familiar dread feel newly enormous and strange. The boy in that neon complex was not entirely alone, for one of the towering new animatronic stars became his unlikely protector, a glamorous bear who sheltered the child and even let him hide inside his own chest cavity to slip past danger. It was a lovely inversion of everything the series had trained players to feel, an animatronic who was gentle, worried and kind, the one machine in the whole building not turned against the boy. Their careful, growing trust gave the sprawling game its warm, beating heart, a small friendship in a vast and hostile place, the monster and the child looking out for one another in the dark. The complex teamed with new animatronic performers, a vain wolf who raced, a swaggering alligator, a bright chicken, each stalking their own corner of the building, and among them lurked a figure genuinely unsettling in a new way. In the great childcare area, a gangly, cheerful attendant presided so long as the lights stayed on, but the instant the room fell dark he transformed into a giggling, menacing thing that came skittering after you, so that the simple act of keeping a light lit became a frantic little battle all its own. It was a fresh spin on the series' oldest fear, the terror of what waits in the dark the moment the light fails. Behind the whole complex moved a figure in a rabbit costume, and the story revealed her to be the young woman corrupted by the digital evil in the earlier virtual chapter, now living a divided life. By day she was an anxious security guard, and by night her will was overtaken by the murderer's lingering malice, driving her to terrible acts she seemed to only half understand. It was a story of possession, and of a person quietly losing a war against a darkness that had crawled inside her. One more life the murderer had reached out to ruin from beyond his own many deaths, and it gave the gleaming new game a genuinely tragic centre. That sprawling game held many possible endings, rewarding curiosity and persistence with wildly different conclusions, from quiet escapes to strange confrontations deep beneath the building. In one, hidden far down in the complex's forgotten lower levels, the murderer himself returned in yet another ruined form, a burnt and clinging remnant still scheming to rebuild himself, refusing as always to simply end. And in another, reached through that little pixel princess quest threaded secretly through the game. A player could strike a real blow against the lingering evil, one of the few endings that felt like genuine hope rather than mere survival. That new game arrived, it must be said gently, in a famously troubled state, full of glitches and rough edges that its studio spent a long time patching and mending after release. It was an enormous, ambitious thing, perhaps larger than could be perfectly polished in time, and its bumpy launch became part of its story, a reminder of how hard it is to build something so vast. Yet the studio kept at it, smoothing and fixing and eventually adding to it, showing a care for the world they had inherited, and in time the game settled into something many players came to love despite its early stumbles. That care later took the form of a substantial downloadable chapter set in the same complex, now fallen into ruin, abandoned and decaying after the events of the main game. This time you played as a different child, the young girl venturing back into the wrecked building in search of the boy from before, who had sent a desperate message asking for help. The once bright complex was now a dark and broken labyrinth, its cheerful attractions rotted and still, and the shift from neon splendour to melancholy ruin gave the chapter a mournful, haunted atmosphere all its own, a beloved place seen after its death. That ruined chapter introduced a new and genuinely frightening presence, a machine built long ago to imitate, to copy the movements and sounds of whoever it watched. The story, drawing threads from the series novels into the games themselves, told of an engineer who had built this mimicking machine to comfort his grieving son by copying the boy. only for the machine to learn all the wrong lessons and become something hollow and dangerous, an imitator with no soul of its own, echoing human behaviour without understanding any of it. It was a chilling new idea for the series, a monster defined not by a trapped spirit, but by a terrible, empty mimicry. That new mimicking horror was significant beyond its scares, because it marked the moment the sprawling world of the novels and the world of the games truly began to knot together. For years the books had told their own tales alongside the games, sometimes echoing them and sometimes diverging, and here at last a villain born in those pages stepped directly into the game's unfolding story. It suggested that the whole enormous tangle of games and books was slowly converging toward a single shared future, and it sent the community into fresh waves of theorising about what it all meant. The girl's journey through that ruined complex offered its own branching endings, its own difficult choices about trust and survival deep in the dark, and it left the larger story hanging on a knife's edge, its questions deliberately unresolved. Who could truly be trusted? What the mimicking machine really wanted? What had become of the boy she came to save? All of it was left open. A fresh mystery laid atop the old ones. It was, in its way, a very fitting continuation, keeping alive the series' oldest promise. That there would always be one more secret, one more locked door, one more thing waiting just out of sight. There are deeper cuts in these games, small details fans treasure that reward a second and third and fourth look. The very first game hid a final, almost impossible challenge behind its ordinary nights, a custom mode in which every animatronic could be set to its maximum aggression at once, a setting players came to speak of in hushed, exhausted tones as the ultimate test. Surviving it demanded a mastery so complete that many devoted players never managed it at all, and completing it rewarded you with a single strange, cryptic image rather than any grand celebration, a quiet in-joke shared only among those who had suffered through it. The second game carried a detail so quietly disturbing that many players never noticed it at all. The friendly new toy animatronics, the story explains, were built with cameras in their faces and linked to a criminal database, able to recognise known offenders and keep the children safe from anyone dangerous who might walk through the doors. It was a well-meaning feature with a horrible irony baked into it. A safety system that could spot a criminal on sight, installed in a restaurant whose true monster was the very man who had built the machines, walking freely among them, invisible to the safeguards meant to catch exactly his kind. Scattered through the earlier games are a pair of shadowy Easter egg figures that have haunted the community for years, dark, glitching duplicates of the bear and the rabbit that appear only rarely and briefly before vanishing or crashing the game entirely. One of them carries a name so deliberately unpronounceable, a jumble of consonants, that fans simply gave up and referred to it by the tangle of letters itself. No one has ever fully explained what these shadow figures are meant to be, and their sheer strangeness, appearing for a heartbeat and then gone, made them some of the most argued over and beloved mysteries in a series already overflowing with them. The metaphysics of how the hauntings actually work became its own quiet fascination, tied to a concept the series slowly developed of a kind of spiritual residue, a leftover essence of a person that could soak into metal and remain there after death. The story suggests that intense suffering in one's final moments could bind a soul to a machine, and that this same residue could be gathered, moved, even used, a haunting idea that gave the series' ghosts a strange internal logic. It meant the animatronics were not merely haunted in the ordinary way, but were in a sense made partly of the people who had died inside them, grief and agony crystallized into something that could move. Fans spent years assembling the scattered dates into a rough timeline, and the numbers themselves became a kind of shared language, a sequence of specific years stretching across decades in which the diner opened, the children vanished, the bites occurred, and the restaurants rose and fell and burned. The story deliberately scatters these dates in fragments, a newspaper here, a paycheck there, a line of dialogue somewhere else. And part of the joy of the community was in gathering them, arguing over them, and slowly building a spine of history for a story that had never been told in order. To follow the timeline is to feel the weight of decades of a haunting that outlasts lifetimes. Even the smallest recurring details became objects of devotion, with particular shades of colour tied to particular characters, the specific phrases that echo across games, the numbers that appear again and again in odd places. The series rewarded obsessive attention like almost nothing before it, hiding meaning in the tiniest corners, in a single frame of a minigame or a barely audible whisper played backward. It trained a whole generation of players to look closer, to trust nothing at face value, to believe that everything, however small, might be a clue, and remarkably often it was. The story spilled far beyond its games, first into a shelf of novels that told their own version of the tale. The first trilogy followed a group of teenagers returning to their hometown and the abandoned restaurant where a childhood friend had been murdered years before, slowly uncovering the old crimes and the killer who committed them. It ran parallel to the games rather than matching them exactly, a separate telling of the same haunted world, and it let the story breathe and slow down in a way the games, bound to their scares and their cameras, never could, dwelling on grief and friendship and the long shadow of a childhood tragedy. That first trilogy hit a startling revelation at its heart, one that reframed everything the reader thought they understood. The girl at the centre of the story, the daughter of the grieving founder, was slowly revealed to be something other than she seemed, a truth about her own nature so quietly devastating that it recoloured the entire tale in hindsight. It was a bold, sad twist, the kind that made readers want to return immediately to the beginning and read it all again with new eyes, and it showed that the creator's gift for the buried gut-punch revelation worked just as well in prose as it did in pixels. A later and much larger run of books took a different, stranger shape, a long series of slim collections, each holding several self-contained short horror stories set in the world of the pizzerias. These tales often had little directly to do with the central plot, spinning instead into small, sharp nightmares about cursed toys and doomed teenagers and terrible bargains, each one a complete little dread all its own, yet a hidden thread quietly connected them across the whole series for those who read closely, a slow-building mystery woven through the epilogues, so that the collection of scattered frights turned out, in the end, to be telling a single story after all. Those short story collections also became the place where some of the series' most important newer ideas were first introduced. Seeds planted in prose that would later grow into the games themselves. It was in these pages that certain concepts and even certain villains first appeared, waiting quietly for years before stepping across into the games and startling everyone who had not read the books. It made the novels essential reading for the truly devoted, no longer a mere side story, but a genuine part of the puzzle. Another set of scattered clues in a mystery that had always been designed to be assembled from many sources at once. Alongside the fiction came a set of official companion books, guides that gathered up the game's scattered secrets and lore into single volumes, and even these became objects of fascination. Rather than simply listing facts, They were laced with their own hidden messages and cryptic clues, so that the very books meant to explain the mystery became part of the mystery, hiding fresh secrets in their margins. It was a perfect expression of the whole series' spirit, the refusal to ever simply tell you the answer, the insistence that even the guidebook must be decoded, that there was always one more layer folded underneath the last. Eventually the whole phenomenon leapt to the largest screen of all, in a film that fans had awaited for the better part of a decade. Its road to the screen was long and winding, passing through the hands of one major studio before finding its true home at another. A company famous for turning modest horror budgets into enormous successes. Along the way, scripts were written and abandoned, directors came and went, and the endless delays became a running sorrow for the fans, until at last the pieces came together and the film was truly, finally happening, after years of hope and doubt. One of the loveliest choices the filmmakers made was to build the animatronics for real, as physical creations rather than digital effects. They turned to the legendary creature workshop founded by the puppeteer behind some of the most beloved characters in film history, the very artists whose gentle puppets had enchanted generations and had them craft towering, tangible versions of the animatronics. The result was that the actors could truly share the screen with the machines, and the audience could feel their real weight and presence, a fitting tribute to a series that had always been, at its heart, about the uncanny life of built things. The film gathered a cast that delighted longtime fans, led by a well-known young actor as a troubled security guard, haunted by the loss of his little brother and struggling to care for his younger sister. It cast a sympathetic officer as an ally who knows more about the pizzeria than she lets on, and, in a piece of casting the community adored. An actor long beloved for his roles in other horror films as the story's central villain. A man who reportedly signed on for multiple films at once, a sign of how much faith everyone had in the world they were building. The film was stuffed with small gifts for the devoted, including a scattering of cameos from the very online performers who had helped make the series famous in the first place. One of the most celebrated of these was a brief appearance by the beloved theorist, whose years of lore videos had done so much to popularise the mystery, playing a small role as a waiter and slipping in his own famous catchphrase about everything being just a theory. Another well-loved performer appeared as a taxi driver, ferrying a character and a busted-up animatronic through the night. These little winks rewarded the fans who had been there from the beginning, folding the community's own history into the film itself. When it opened, it did so in an unusual way, arriving in theatres and on a streaming service on the very same day, and despite that, or perhaps because of it drew an enormous audience. It posted one of the biggest opening weekends a horror film had ever seen, and went on to become, in time, the most successful film its studio had ever released, a genuine triumph pulled from a series that had begun life as one discouraged man's last desperate idea. The people who had grown up flinching at these games filled the theatres to see their nightmares walk at last. The critics, it must be said gently, were less enchanted than the fans, and the film drew a decidedly mixed reception from reviewers even as audiences embraced it warmly, giving it far higher marks than the professional verdicts suggested. That gap between the critical coldness and the fan devotion was itself very much in keeping with the whole history of the series, which had always been beloved far more by its players than by the wider establishment. The people who had waited years to see Freddy on the big screen did not need anyone's permission to love it. And love it they did. The film closed its credits with a piece of music that felt like coming home to longtime fans, a song made years earlier by an online musician who had helped invent the whole idea of songs about the series. That song had grown into one of the most recognised pieces of music ever born from a video game, played hundreds of millions of times, and hearing it swell over the credits of the finished film was a quiet acknowledgement of just how much the fans and their creativity had built the phenomenon alongside its creator. The community had always been part of the story, and here, at the end of the movie, the story thanked them. The film's success ensured more would follow, and a sequel arrived in due course, bringing with it the brighter, stranger cast of the second game, the sleek toy animatronics and the tangled broken one, and the little balloon-clutching figure, and of course the weeping puppet. Where the first film had introduced the world, the sequel could dig deeper into the growing mystery, expanding the story on the screen much as the games had expanded it across their own long run. The nightmares that had begun on a lonely computer years before had become, improbably, a film series with a future of its own stretching out ahead. Not every game in the long run was a chapter of the central nightmare, and some of the loveliest were made for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. At one point the creator built a small game to raise money for children's charity, a bright and heartfelt little adventure worlds away from the dread of the main series, made simply to do some good. He collaborated on it with one of the very online performers who had helped make the series famous, turning the whole enterprise back toward kindness for a while, a reminder that behind all the murdered pixel children and rotted suits was a man who cared, quietly and genuinely, about real ones. Behind all of it stood the strange, private figure of the creator himself, who had gone from a discouraged near-quitter to one of the most influential names in modern horror, and who eventually chose to step away. After years of relentless work and a life largely kept out of the spotlight, he announced that he was retiring from active development to focus on his family and his many children, laying down the enormous thing he had built to return to the quiet life of a father. It was a fitting ending for a series so preoccupied with parents and children, the maker of all those broken families choosing, in the end, to go home to his own. The story he built did not stop when he set it down. The new studio took up the work, continuing the games and expanding the enormous complex of the later chapters with further adventures, keeping the mystery alive for a new generation of players. The world he had made proved larger than any one creator, a sprawling haunted house with room for many hands, and the transition showed how completely the series had grown beyond its origins as a single person's project into something like a living institution, tended now by a whole team who had grown up loving it themselves. That new stewardship carried its own quiet weight, the challenge of honouring a mystery so beloved and so fiercely scrutinised that any misstep would be noticed and debated for years. The people now guiding the series had in many cases been fans first, players who had theorised and argued alongside everyone else before finding themselves suddenly responsible for the very story they had puzzled over. It gave the later chapters a particular flavour, the sense of a torch being passed to hands that truly understood what they were holding. That felt the weight of the grief and the wonder both, and through all of it the creator's fingerprints remained, in the shape of the whole thing, in its refusal to explain itself, in its habit of hiding tenderness underneath terror. Even as new hands took up the work, the series kept the strange soul he had given it, that peculiar mix of cheap jump scares and genuine sorrow, of cartoon animals and murdered children, of a lullaby that must never stop playing. It remained unmistakably the thing born from that one discouraged night, grown enormous, but never quite losing the fingerprints of the man who had almost given up, and then, instead, made a nightmare. The true engine of the whole phenomenon, In the end, it was never the creator alone, but the community that grew up around the mystery. From the very beginning, the games were designed to be puzzled over, their story hidden so deeply that no single player could hope to uncover it alone, and so an entire culture of theorizing sprang up around them. People pored over every frame, slowed down every clip, played faint sounds backward, translated every flickering clue, argued for years over who was bitten and who was haunting whom. The mystery was never meant to be solved by one person. It was meant to be solved by everyone, together, and that shared act of solving became a thing of joy all its own. At the centre of that theorizing culture stood a handful of beloved online interpreters, and one in particular became almost synonymous with decoding the series, a theorist whose long, careful, wildly popular videos walked millions of viewers through the tangled lore piece by piece. His enthusiasm and his willingness to be wrong, to revise, to chase a thread for years, embodied the whole spirit of the community, and his influence grew so great that the creator himself sometimes seemed to be in quiet conversation with the theories, a rare and remarkable dance between an author and his audience, each responding to the other across the years. The performers who first made the games famous never really left, either, and the series remained bound up with the culture of online play. The early screamers and laughers who had filmed themselves flinching at the first game had helped invent a whole style of horror entertainment. The game as much a performance to be watched as a thing to be played, and the series kept feeding that culture with each new instalment. For a great many people, the memory of Five Nights at Freddy's is not of playing it at all, but of watching someone they loved to watch jump and yelp and laugh in the dark, a shared second-hand fright. Music became one of the most astonishing things the community built, a whole flourishing tradition of songs written about the games. One musician in particular, working online, made a song about the very first game that grew into one of the most recognised and beloved pieces of music ever to come from a video game, played hundreds of millions of times and cherished by a generation. It helped invent the whole idea of songs about the series, and behind it came a flood of others. Countless fan-made anthems and ballads and laments, until the music of the fandom became almost as vast and beloved as the games themselves. Those songs did something quietly remarkable, giving voice to the sorrow that the games kept hidden beneath their scares. Where the games buried their grief in flickering mini-games and cryptic hints, the songs sang it out plainly, aching ballads sung from the perspective of the trapped children, or the doomed guards, or the haunted machines, turning the subtext into melody. For many fans, it was through these songs that the emotional heart of the series first truly landed. The realization, set to music, that this was a story about lost children, an unbearable loss, far more than it was a story about jump scares. The fans built games too, an entire sprawling ecosystem of fan-made creations set in the world, some of them small tributes and some of them ambitious, full experiences that rivaled the official games in craft and imagination. Rather than resenting this, the creator largely welcomed it, even celebrating and supporting the best of it, and in a gesture of remarkable generosity he came, over time, to lift up talented fan creators, helping some of them turn their passion into real careers. The world he had made became a kind of commons, a place where anyone with an idea and enough determination could add their own room to the haunted house. The merchandise became its own quiet empire, the characters escaping the screen to become plush toys and figures and shelves full of collectibles, beloved objects for a whole generation of children and teenagers. It was a strange and wonderful irony that these murderous machines from a genuinely dark horror story became cuddly bedroom companions, soft versions of the very things meant to terrify, clutched by the same kids who stayed up too late watching people scream at them. The friendly and the frightening pressed together once again, exactly as the whole series had always done. Perhaps the strangest and most telling thing about the series is who came to love it most. For a horror story steeped in murdered children and rotting corpses became, improbably, a phenomenon adored by children themselves. Something in it spoke directly to the young. The cartoon animals and the puzzle box mystery and the safe, delicious thrill of being scared. And a whole generation grew up on it, trading theories on playgrounds, begging for the plush toys, waiting breathlessly for each new secret. It became a rare thing, a genuine piece of childhood folklore, a modern campfire story passed from kid to kid, kept alive by the sheer devotion of the young. That devotion is why the series has endured so long past the point where most trends fade, still generating new games and films and theories many years after it should by all rights have run its course. It endures because it was never really just a series of jump scare games. It was a mystery vast enough to live inside, a story generous enough to invite everyone to help tell it, a sorrow deep enough to feel true. The community did not merely consume it. They inhabited it, and in inhabiting it they kept it alive, and keep it alive still. Part of the genius of the first game, and the reason it spread so far so fast, was how small and humble it was. It was cheap to buy and short to play, and it ran on modest machines that could never have handled a grand sprawling game, which meant almost anyone could try it. And almost anyone could film themselves trying it. Its horror came not from expensive spectacle, but from tension and timing, and a few still images that refused to move, proving that fear could be conjured from the simplest of ingredients, from patience and dread, and the terrible anticipation of a scare you knew was coming, but could not predict. That lesson rippled outward across the whole medium, inspiring a wave of imitators and inheritors, a whole small genre of games built around cheerful mascots turned menacing, around watching and hiding and surviving the night. The series had shown that a friendly cartoon face could be made deeply unsettling, that the uncanny space between the cute and the wrong was a rich vein of horror, and countless creators followed that trail. For years afterward, the influence of that first little office game could be felt everywhere, in games about smiling things that should not move, stalking players through the dark. The fandom's creativity poured out in every direction beyond songs and theories. Fans built elaborate animated films using the characters, staging their own stories and reenacting the lore in loving, painstaking detail until an entire tradition of fan animation grew up around the series. They drew endless art, sewed costumes, and staged the characters in 1,000 new situations, funny and tragic and tender by turns. The world proved to be one people did not merely want to visit, but wanted to live inside, to add to make their own, and that impulse became one of the most creative fan movements the medium had ever seen. Much of that creativity flowed toward the sorrowful heart of the thing rather than its scares. The fan works, so often, were not about the terror at all, but about the tragedy, imagining the last days of the murdered children, the grief of the parents, the loneliness of the trapped souls. The community seemed to understand, collectively and instinctively, that the true subject of the series was loss, and they returned to that loss again and again in their art, in their music, and their stories, drawn to the sadness underneath the fear like moths to a dim and mournful light. The games themselves remained, throughout, marvels of restraint, most of them small and focused and playable in an evening, yet each one dense with hidden meaning waiting to be excavated over months and years. That was the strange magic of them, that something so slight on the surface could contain so much beneath it, a shallow pool that turned out to be bottomless. You could finish one in a night and still be arguing about what it meant a decade later, and that impossible ratio of size to depth was a large part of why the series held people so long and so tightly. There are individual characters and small mysteries scattered through the series that fans have adopted and adored far beyond their moments on screen. The golden, empty bear that appears so rarely in the first game became one of the most theorized figures of all. An unmoving heap of a costume that seems to hold a spirit of its own, and the question of exactly which lost child, if any, dwells within it has never been settled, only argued, gently and endlessly, across the years. It is the sort of mystery the series specialised in, a thing glimpsed for a heartbeat and then debated for a decade. The famous bite referenced in the earliest games, the one that cost a person part of their brain, spawned its own long-running debate about who exactly the victim had been. For years fans wondered whether it might have been the night guard of the prequel or some other unnamed figure, sifting the scraps of dialogue for any clue. The series never fully resolved it, and that very refusal to answer became part of its charm. A wound in the story's past that everyone could feel the shape of, but no one could quite see, endlessly discussed, never closed. The underground facility chapter hid a wealth of small delights, chief among them the cheerful automated voice that insisted on renaming you each night with a string of increasingly absurd nonsense names, a running joke that undercut the dread with genuine comedy. That same chapter tucked away a secret ending reached only by ignoring your instructions entirely and hiding in a quiet back room, playing an old arcade game while the night passed you by, a strange and lonely little escape from the horror that fans treasured for how unexpected and human it felt, a moment of simply sitting still and refusing to play along. One of the salvaged horrors of the restaurant chapter carried a secret folded right into its name, a lanky black and white figure whose title turned out to be an acronym, each letter standing for a step in a cold clinical plan to lure and capture and contain another creature. It was a small, chilling detail, the sort of thing a player might never notice until someone pointed it out, and then could never unsee. A whole sinister purpose hidden in a name. Proof once again that in this series nothing was ever quite as simple or as innocent as it first appeared. The Gleaming Later complex introduced a character who embodied the series' oldest fear in a single body. A tall daycare attendant with two faces, gentle and helpful and sunny so long as the light stayed on, but transforming the instant the room went dark into a giggling, grasping menace. It was the fear of the dark made literal and given a personality, a being who was your friend in the light and your hunter in the black, and keeping the lights on around him became one of the most nerve-wracking and beloved sequences of the whole game, a perfect distillation of what the series had always been about. That same complex gave its other new animatronics small human touches that made them linger. There was a Vein Wolf, whose confidence, players discovered, was fragile and cracked underneath, a creature who stared into mirrors and needed reassurance, unexpectedly sympathetic for a monster meant to chase you. There was a swaggering, aggressive alligator and a bright, motherly chicken, each given just enough personality to feel like more than an obstacle. Even in its newest and most spectacular chapter, the series kept doing what it had always done, hiding little aches of character inside its machines, That sprawling later game rewarded exploration with a whole spread of different endings, more than most players would ever see on their own, ranging from quiet escapes into the dawn to strange and secret confrontations buried deep in the building's forgotten places. Each demanded its own particular path, its own set of discoveries, so that fully understanding the game meant playing it again and again, chasing every branch. It was the series' old love of hidden depths taken to its largest scale yet. A game that quietly held far more than any single playthrough could ever reveal. So much of the series' power lives in its sound, in what you hear far more than in what you see. The games are built on a foundation of small, dreadful noises, the distant thump of something moving in another room, the metallic groan of a machine shifting its weight, the pattering of footsteps that grow closer in the dark. You spend so much of each night simply listening, straining to place a sound, and the games understood that the ear, in the dark, is more easily terrified than the eye, that a noise you cannot quite identify is worse than any monster you can clearly see. The famous scare of the series, the sudden shriek that accompanies a lunging animatronic, became one of the most recognised sounds in all of gaming, a jolt so sharp it could send a player leaping from their chair. Yet the games used it with real restraint, holding it back through long stretches of tense quiet so that when it finally came, it landed with full force. The horror was never really in the scream itself, but in the long, dreadful anticipation of it, the minutes of mounting silence that made the eventual shock unbearable, a lesson in patience that the whole series had mastered. Silence, in fact, was one of the series' sharpest tools, deployed as carefully as any noise. The games knew exactly when to fall completely quiet, letting a hush stretch out until your own heartbeat seemed loud, until the absence of sound became its own kind of threat. And against that silence, the small human sounds landed all the harder, the friendly ramble of the phone calls, the sweet tinkling of the music box, and above all the sound every player longed for, the chorus of cheering children that meant 6 a.m. had finally come, and you had survived another night. The whole look of the games worked hand in hand with the sound to unsettle, a deliberately lo-fi, slightly grainy aesthetic of security camera static and dim-rendered rooms. The animatronics, rendered as still images rather than fluid models, held an uncanny stiffness that made them feel wrong in a way smooth animation never could, caught somewhere between a photograph and a corpse. It was horror built from limitation, from the grainy and the static and the still, and it proved that atmosphere and restraint could frighten far more deeply than any amount of gore or spectacle. Each game found a new way to weaponize the one thing the player could not avoid spending, their own attention. In the first it was the cameras and the power, in the second the mask and the music box, in the fourth the doors and the desperate listening. But always the core was the same, a set of demands on your focus that could never all be met at once, forcing you to gamble your attention and pray you had guessed right. That was the true engine of the dread, not the monsters themselves, but the impossible arithmetic of watching everything at once, the certainty that whatever you were not looking at was exactly where the danger would come from. The series spread onto nearly every screen a person might own, which was a large part of how it reached so deeply into a generation. Beginning on computers, the games soon arrived on phones and tablets and living room consoles, so that the nightmare could be carried in a pocket and pulled out anywhere, played under the covers by a child who should have been asleep. This sheer availability, the way the games turned up on whatever device a young fan happened to have, helped make the series a fixture of a whole era of childhood, always within reach, always just a tap away from another sleepless night. Between the major chapters, the creator often slipped out smaller games and surprises, keeping the world humming with activity. There were free updates that dressed the games in Halloween decorations, seasonal treats for the fans, and there were odd little side games that experimented with entirely different styles, a burst of variety that kept the series from ever feeling predictable. This restless output, this refusal to simply repeat the same formula, was part of why the series stayed alive and surprising for so long, always offering something new alongside the familiar dread, always willing to wander somewhere strange. The commercial scale of it all became genuinely staggering, the games selling in enormous numbers, and the videos of people playing them amassing views beyond easy counting. Billions of moments of people around the world watching someone brave the night. What had begun as one man's last-ditch attempt to salvage a failing career grew into one of the most commercially successful independent creations in the medium's history. A genuine empire built from a single office and a handful of still images. Few success stories in the whole medium are quite so improbable or so complete. And yet, for all that scale, the series never quite lost the intimate, homemade quality that had made it special in the first place. Even at the height of its fame, with films in theatres and merchandise on every shelf, the games still felt, somehow, like the work of one person tinkering in the dark, still full of odd personal touches and hidden jokes and buried griefs. That contrast between its enormous reach and its handmade heart was part of its peculiar charm, the sense of an intimate little nightmare that had, almost against its own nature, conquered the world. It is worth pausing over the children at the centre of it all, because the fandom never let them remain mere plot points. Over the years, players gave the murdered children faces and names and personalities, imagining who they had been before they died, mourning them as if they were real, writing them stories and songs and quiet tributes. The series had given only fragments, a handful of small spirits glimpsed in pixel minigames, and the community filled in the rest with tenderness, refusing to let them be forgotten, insisting that even these tiny ghosts deserved to be remembered and grieved. The parents haunt the story just as deeply as the children, in their own quiet way. The whole enormous saga can be read as a study of fathers, the one who became a monster and the one who became a mourner. Both of them undone by the loss of their children, both of them shaping decades of horror out of their grief. One father's answer to loss was cruelty and murder, and the other's was a long, patient labour to set things right, and the contrast between them, two men broken by the same kind of sorrow choosing opposite paths, is the moral spine that runs through the whole tangled tale. There is a particular gut punch the series delivered more than once, the slow realization that the small, frightened character you had been playing was not a stranger at all, but someone bound up in the central tragedy, a member of the very family at the heart of it. That trick of letting you inhabit a victim or a survivor without knowing who they were until the end gave the games a terrible intimacy, the sense that you had not merely watched the tragedy but lived a piece of it yourself, that the grief was not being told to you from a distance but handed to you to carry in your own hands. The saddest thread of all may be the simplest one. The image of a father who could not save his son, running like a wound through the whole series. A little boy dies in an animatronic's jaws while his family looks on helpless, and everything that follows, all the murders and hauntings and burning buildings, spirals outward from that first unbearable loss. Beneath the machines and the mystery and the jump scares, the series keeps circling back to that oldest and most human of terrors, the fear of losing a child, and the even deeper fear of not being able to protect the ones we love from the dark. And yet the story never leaves its grief entirely without hope, which is perhaps why it comforts as much as it frightens. Again and again, across the games, there are moments of release. The murdered children finally freed, the weeping puppet finally at peace, a father's voice finally saying that it is time to rest. For all its horror, the series believes in its strange and sorrowful way that the lost can be set free, that grief can find an ending, that even the most restless spirit can, at the last, be laid gently down to sleep. It is a horror story, yes, but it is also, underneath, a long prayer for peace. Part of why the series struck such a deep nerve is that it drew on something real, a genuine cultural memory that many people carried without ever quite examining it. For decades, there have been family restaurants filled with animatronic animal bands, machines that sang and played and waved for crowds of children over pizza and arcade games. Cheerful mechanical performers meant to delight, and yet many children found those very machines faintly unsettling even then. The fixed grins, the jerky movements, the glassy eyes, and the series reached straight into that half-buried childhood unease and gave it a shape and a story. The particular dread the games conjure has a name that describes it well. The strange discomfort we feel toward things that are almost human but not quite, that fall into an uncanny gap between the living and the lifeless. An animatronic sits squarely in that gap, a face built to seem friendly that nonetheless reads as wrong, a body that moves but does not breathe, and the series understood that this quiet wrongness was already lurking in the machines themselves. It did not have to invent the fear. It only had to point at something people had always secretly felt. What the series did so brilliantly was to take a place associated with birthday parties and childhood joy and quietly turn it into a haunted house. The pizza restaurant, the safest and most cheerful of settings, became a tomb, its beloved mascots became stalkers, and its happy jingles became threats. And that inversion of the familiar into the frightening was far more powerful than any invented monster could have been. It made the horror feel close and personal, rooted in a real kind of place that many players had actually visited, so that the dread lingered even after the screen went dark. There was, too, a faint real-world echo of malfunction and danger behind it all. The knowledge that such complex machines could and sometimes did break down in unsettling ways, that a thing built to entertain children could, through simple mechanical failure, become a hazard. The series took that small kernel of genuine unease, the sense that these were powerful machines pretending to be toys, and grew a whole mythology of horror from it. It reminded players that the line between the delightful and the dangerous had always been thinner than anyone wanted to admit. By turning that nostalgia inside out, the series did something lasting to an entire generation's memory. For countless people, it became impossible to look at a grinning animatronic band the same way ever again. The innocent machines of childhood forever tinged now with a whisper of dread. That is a rare kind of cultural power, to reach back into a shared memory and quietly recolour it, and it is part of why the series lodged so deeply and so permanently in the imagination, why it could not simply be played and forgotten, but lingered, changing the way people saw the ordinary world. One of the boldest things about the series is how much it was willing to leave unanswered, on purpose. Where most stories rushed to tie up their threads, this one seemed to delight in leaving questions open, in raising new mysteries faster than it resolved old ones, entrusting its audience to sit comfortably in uncertainty. The identity of certain spirits, the exact order of certain events, the true nature of certain figures, all of it was left deliberately hazy, and rather than frustrating the fans, this open-endedness became a gift, an invitation to keep wondering, keep theorizing, keep returning. That refusal to fully explain itself was a genuine design philosophy, not a failure of storytelling. The creator understood that a mystery loses its magic the moment it is completely solved, that the pleasure is in the puzzling rather than the answer, and so he kept the whole thing perpetually just out of reach, always one clue short of certainty. It was a risky way to tell a story, and it demanded enormous trust from the audience, but it produced something rare, a tale that could sustain years of devoted attention precisely because it never let itself be finished. The endless releasing of new games and chapters was part of the same design, each new installment answering a few old questions while opening several new ones, so that the mystery could never quite be caught up to. Just as the community would begin to feel it had assembled a complete picture, a new piece would arrive and scatter the puzzle again, sending everyone back to their theories. It could have felt cynical, this constant deferral, and yet it rarely did, because each new piece was made with such care and such strangeness that chasing it always felt worth the effort. There is a particular joy, the series seemed to understand, in not knowing, in the space of possibility that opens up when a story withholds its final answers. In that space, every fan can hold their own version of the truth, can imagine their own explanation, can feel a sense of ownership over a story that was, in a real way, only ever half told, the other half left for them to complete. It made the whole enormous community into collaborators, rather than mere spectators, each of them holding a piece, none of them holding all of it, all of them bound together by the shared act of wondering. And so the story goes on, still opening new doors, still hiding new secrets, still refusing to end even long after its creator laid it down. It has outlasted the fads and the trends and the confident predictions of its decline, enduring because it was built to endure, built as a mystery deep enough to live inside for a lifetime. There may never be a final answer, a last locked door thrown open, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. A haunting that keeps its secrets, a story that keeps its hold, a nightmare that never quite lets you wake and never quite wants to. There is a quieter kind of horror threaded through the series that is easy to overlook, the horror of the ordinary worker trapped in an impossible job. In most of the games you play as a night guard, an everyday person taking a low-paying shift because they need the money, sat alone in the dark and left to fend for themselves against dangers no one warned them about. The company that employs you is cheerfully, monstrously indifferent, and much of the dark comedy of the phone calls comes from that indifference, the calm voice reassuring you that the establishment cannot be held responsible for death or dismemberment, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. That negligent corporation becomes, in its way, a villain as chilling as any animatronic. A company that keeps reopening its deadly restaurants under new names again and again, papering over disappearances and injuries and lawsuits in the endless pursuit of profit. The murders may be the work of one man, but the machine that keeps putting people in harm's way, that values its brand over the lives of its workers and its customers, is something larger and colder and horribly familiar. It gave the series a satirical edge underneath the scares, a quiet anger at the kind of institution that treats human beings as expendable. The choice to make the player an underpaid worker rather than a hero was a masterstroke of dread. You are not a soldier or a monster hunter, but an ordinary person with no weapons and no training. Someone who simply needs a paycheck and finds themselves fighting for their life because a company cut corners. That powerlessness is the true engine of the fear. The sense of being small and expendable and utterly on your own. And it made the horror relatable in a way that grander power fantasies never could. Because almost everyone knows what it is to be tired and underpaid and alone in the dark. There is something quietly universal, too, in the setting of the night shift itself. That lonely stretch of hours when the rest of the world is asleep and you are awake and watchful and by yourself. The series tapped into the particular loneliness of being awake when you should not be, of watching a clock crawl toward morning, of longing for the dawn, and it turned that ordinary experience into something charged with dread. Anyone who has ever worked a long night alone, listening to a quiet building settle around them, knows a small piece of the feeling the games are built on. For all that they began as faceless threats, the original 4 animatronics grew into genuine icons, beloved characters in their own right rather than mere monsters. The bear became the calm, central figure, the face of the whole franchise. The rabbit and the chicken each gathered their own devoted admirers, and the fox, with his tattered look and his desperate dash down the hall, became a particular favourite, adopted by fans who saw something sympathetic in the broken, neglected performer left to rot behind his curtain. The community came to love these machines the way one loves old friends, flaws and frights and all. That affection is why the merchandise resonated so deeply, rather than feeling like a cynical cash-in. When fans clutched a plush version of a monster that had once made them scream, they were embracing a character they had come to genuinely care for. A familiar face from a story they loved. The friendly and the frightening had been braided together so completely that the same figure could be both a nightmare and a comfort object, terrifying on the screen at midnight and cozy on the shelf by day, and there was something quietly wonderful in that, in monsters soft enough to hug. The series has now run long enough that it has grown up alongside its audience, and that shared history has become part of its meaning. The children who screamed at the first game in their bedrooms years ago are older now, some of them grown, and the series has aged with them, deepening its story, expanding its world, following them through the years. There is a whole generation for whom these games are not merely entertainment, but a landmark of their childhood. A shared reference point, a thing they discovered young and carried with them into adulthood. For that generation, a strange new layer of feeling has settled over the series, the soft ache of nostalgia. The games that once frightened them now also comfort them, tied up with memories of a particular time in their lives, of staying up too late, of watching favourite performers, of trading theories with friends. The horror has mellowed, for many, into something warm and bittersweet, a beloved artifact of growing up, so that returning to it feels less like being scared and more like coming home to a strange and cherished place from long ago. And that, in the end, may be the most unexpected fate of all for a series born from one man's despair and built on the fear of murdered children in the dark. It became, against all odds, a thing people love, a thing they find comfort in, a thing they return to for the strange familiar piece of it. The nightmares turned, over the years, into a kind of home, which is perhaps the gentlest and most surprising ending this long, strange story could ever have arrived at. The way each new game was announced became a beloved ritual all its own, a game before the game. Rather than ordinary marketing, the creator took to quietly posting cryptic images on his website, dark and grainy pictures that seemed at first to show almost nothing at all. But fans quickly learned to take those images and brighten them, adjust them, pull them apart, and hidden inside the darkness they would find messages, faint words and shapes and clues teasing what was coming next. It turned the wait between games into a frenzy of communal detective work, everyone racing to decode the latest shadowy hint. Those teaser images became a language between the creator and his audience, a private game of hide and seek played in the days before each release. He would bury a single word in the black of a picture, and within hours thousands of fans would have found it, argued over it, spun theories from it, and he would post another, and the whole community would light up again. It was a remarkably intimate way to build anticipation, treating the fans not as customers to be advertised to, but as fellow players in an ongoing puzzle, trusted to look closely and find what he had hidden. The creator's relationship with his community was playful in other ways too, full of surprises and fake-outs and sudden gifts. Games would appear with little or no warning, dropping out of nowhere to delight and startle the fans. He would tease one thing and deliver another, or release something entirely unexpected, keeping everyone perpetually off balance and perpetually delighted. That unpredictability, that sense that anything might happen at any moment, kept the community in a state of happy vigilance for years, always watching, always ready for the next surprise to arrive. There was a genuine warmth underneath all the tricks and teases, a creator who clearly loved his audience and loved playing with them. He would sometimes speak to the fans directly, thanking them, joking with them, responding to their theories. A rare closeness between a maker and the people who loved what he made. For all the darkness of the stories he told, the man behind them came across as kind and grateful and a little bit mischievous. Someone who never quite got over the wonder of having gone from ignored to beloved, and who never stopped trying to give his fans one more thing to puzzle over. If you gather up all the images the series returns to again and again, they form a strange and dreamlike vocabulary all their own. There is the empty show stage with its silent performers waiting under the lights. There is the curtain in the corner and whatever waits behind it. There are the long dark hallways, the flickering fluorescent lights, the grainy static of a security feed. The vents you cannot see into. There is always a clock, always crawling towards 6, and always the hope of a morning that feels impossibly far away. These images repeat across game after game like the recurring furniture of a single long nightmare. Running beneath so many of the games is a single quiet idea that things built for one purpose were secretly built for another. The friendly performers hide corpses. The safety features designed to protect children were installed by the very man who preyed on them. The cheerful rental machines were engineered, in secret, to kill. Again and again the series returns to this betrayal of purpose, this sense that the wholesome surface of a thing conceals a rotten intent underneath, and it is one of the deepest sources of its unease, the suggestion that nothing cheerful can be entirely trusted. The series also loved the long, slow dread of anticipation over the quick shock of surprise, and much of its horror lived in waiting rather than in seeing. You spend most of each night waiting, watching, listening, bracing, and the actual scares are brief punctuation at the end of long sentences of tension. That patience, that willingness to make you sit in dread for minutes at a time, was unusual and brave, and it is part of why the games lodge so deeply, because the fear they create is not a momentary jolt, but a slow, saturating unease that soaks into you over the course of a night. For all its darkness, the series is strangely soothing to trace from a safe distance, the way any long and well-worn story becomes soothing once you know its shape. To walk slowly through its history, its games and its secrets and its sorrows, is to move through something vast and intricate and, in its own way, complete, a whole world with its own rules and its own rhythms and its own aching heart. There is comfort in that completeness, in the sense of a story large enough to get lost in and gentle enough, underneath, to hold you while you rest. Amid all the dread, the small human voices that reach the player became some of the most cherished parts of the whole series. The recorded phone messages in the early games, left by a co-worker you never see, offered the only real warmth in those long dark nights. A friendly, nervous, rambling presence trying to help you survive, even as his own story quietly darkened toward its end. Fans grew genuinely fond of that unseen caller, mourning him when the recordings turned grim, treasuring his calm reassurances precisely because they were the one kind human thing in a place designed to be pitiless. That the creator himself provided that voice, and most of the others in the early games, only deepened the intimacy of it. There was something fitting in the maker of the whole nightmare also being the friendly voice trying to guide you through it, lending his own tones to the story he had built alone in the dark. When later games brought in professional performers to give the characters fuller voices, it marked how far the series had grown, but many fans kept a special tenderness for those early recordings, for the homemade warmth of one man speaking softly into his own creation. The way the early games arrived, tumbling out one after another in rapid succession, created a shared cultural moment that those who lived through it still remember vividly. New games appeared so quickly that the community barely had time to solve one mystery before the next arrived. And for a stretch of time it felt as though the whole internet was puzzling over the same secrets at once, in real time, together, that sense of a story unfolding live, of everyone racing to keep up with a creator working at a furious pace, gave those years a particular electric excitement that is rare and hard to recapture. To have been there for it, refreshing the pages, watching the theories fly, waiting for the next teaser to be decoded, was to be part of something genuinely communal, a mystery being solved by a crowd in the moment of its telling. Even for those who came to it later, tracing the whole thing after the fact, there is a sense of that shared history, of a story that belonged not to one person, but to the enormous restless community that grew up around it, all of them puzzling in the dark together, all of them chasing the same faint clues toward the same dim and sorrowful truth. The games were built around a steady, mounting escalation, each night of the working week a little harder than the last. The animatronics grew bolder, moved sooner, pressed closer, so that the calm of the first night gave way, evening by evening, to something frantic and desperate by the fifth. And beyond the ordinary week there were almost always further challenges waiting. Extra nights and harder modes for those who wanted to push themselves, so that the true limits of each game lay far past its official ending, in trials fierce enough to defeat all but the most dedicated. That tradition of a tunable custom challenge, letting players set the aggression of each character themselves and mix them however they liked, became a beloved fixture across the series. It handed the fans the keys to their own torment, inviting them to build the exact nightmare they wished to attempt, and a whole culture of hardcore players sprang up around conquering the hardest possible settings. For these players, the horror gave way to something almost athletic, a test of reflex and memory and nerve pushed to its absolute edge. mastery wrung from games most people found frightening enough on their gentlest settings. The psychological dimension of the games ran deeper than the jolts, for they were forever trying to make you doubt your own senses. Hallucinations flickered at the corners of the screen, phantom figures lunged that could not truly hurt you. Images spliced themselves into the dark for a single frame and vanished. You could never be entirely sure whether what you had just seen was a real threat or a trick of a frazzled mind, and that uncertainty wormed its way inside you, turning the games into an assault not just on your nerves, but on your very confidence in what was and was not there in the dark with you. That constant undermining of perception was part of what made the fear linger after the game was switched off. Long after the screen went dark, a player might find their imagination supplying phantom movements in their own quiet room, the games having trained them to distrust stillness, to expect the shadows to shift. It was horror that followed you out of the game and into your own night, a testament to how deeply these simple little office games could burrow, how much dread they could conjure from so little, how long that dread could linger once it had taken hold. Across the whole saga, the restaurants themselves changed names and shapes again and again, a whole lineage of establishments rising and falling across the decades. From a small family diner, to the famous pizza place, to the sinister rental company, to the vast glittering complex of the later games. Each is a new face on the same cursed enterprise, the company forever rebuilding, rebranding, reopening, unable or unwilling to let its deadly business die. That endless cycle of reinvention became one of the series' quiet motifs, the sense of a rot that simply changes its name and carries on, never truly ending, always opening its doors once more to a new generation of the unsuspecting. For a great many young people, this strange little series became an unlikely doorway into a much larger love. It drew them into the pleasures of piecing a story together, of looking closely and thinking carefully, of caring deeply about a fictional world and the people who made it. Some found in it their first taste of true storytelling, of a narrative that trusted them to work and to wonder. Others found their way into making things of their own, into art or animation or music or writing, all of it sparked by a handful of cheap little horror games about a haunted pizza place. Whatever else it was, the series became a beginning for countless people, the first great obsession that opened the way to many more. By now you may notice how much of this long, strange story is really about grief, hiding underneath all the scares. It is a story about murdered children who cannot rest, about grieving fathers, about a family destroyed from within, about souls trapped in machines and longing only to be set free. The jump scares are the surface. Underneath them runs a deep, sad river of loss, of parents and children reaching for each other across the barrier of death, of a wrong so great that it takes an entire saga and a burning building and a father's final words to even begin to set it right. Perhaps that is why it holds people the way it does, far more tightly than a simple horror game ought to. There is something in it that speaks to old and tender fears, the fear of the dark, the fear of the machines that were supposed to be friendly, the fear of losing the people we love and of not being able to save them. And there is comfort too, buried in the sorrow, in the moments when the lost children are finally freed, when the weeping puppet is at last at peace, when a father's voice says, gently, that it is time to rest now. So let it all settle over you softly now, the way the quiet settles over an empty restaurant after closing. The honking cartoon nose, the lullaby that must never stop, the golden bear that appears once in 1,000 nights, the little pixel children waiting to be comforted, the burning building and the father's last words, the friendly bear sheltering a lost child in a glittering neon maze, the discouraged man at his computer deciding not to quit after all and changing everything. There is nothing left for you to watch tonight, no cameras to flick between, no doors to hold, no power to ration. The long shift is over, and the building has gone dark and quiet and still, and for once the stillness is only stillness, and nothing is coming down the hall. Let the facts drift over you like the last light fading from a stage after the show, each one glowing for a moment, and then softening into the dark, leaving only the sense of a strange, sad story that turned out, all along, to be about love and loss more than fear. Let your breathing slow. Let the room grow warm and safe around you. Somewhere the animatronics are only machines again, standing quiet on their little stage, and the children are at rest, and the music box is wound down at last with nothing left to guard against. You do not have to stay awake to keep watch. Nothing here needs watching anymore. The story will keep itself safe until morning, all its ghosts finally sleeping. Rest now. You have earned this quiet too. Good night, and sleep well.